Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us in this workshop today with Dr. Christa Wichterich, with whom we are going to discuss subordination in global care chains and the case of migrant workers. I am very, very pleased to welcome her in the workshop. I hope most of you have seen actually the video lecture, the excellent video lecture that she prepared for the course, so we can have a more meaningful discussion. Just to give you the rules of the house very briefly, this session is being recorded. So if you have problems with that, please keep your camera off. Otherwise, we would really appreciate if you turn the cameras on. It's nearly 3 years now that we are struggling speaking to the screens. It's very, very difficult, to keep the spirits high when we don't see faces. So if possible, please turn your cameras on. So of course, Christa and all of us can see you. I would also remind you to please keep your microphones off to make sure that we have the best quality possible for the video lecture that is being recorded, and that we are going to put it in the course platform. Very briefly, I'm going to just pose a question to Christa to start the conversation. She'll give us her opening remarks on that question, and we will open up for your questions. It's really the possibility for all of you to pose questions to the expert. We're really lucky to have her today. So please either type your question in the chat platform or raise your hand, and let's have a conversation, an engaging conversation with Christa. So perhaps to kickstart the conversation, thanks again very much, Christa, for making time for this one. I would just really first want to reiterate the importance that when we speak about care workers, we are focusing on migrant care workers. We are not focusing on domestic workers, in the countries, but really looking at these care chains. And the first question is really about that. And I think it's a question that Brian has already, has also posed to the workshop, which is really what's the difference between global value chains and global care chains. And Christa, if you can elaborate on that, because really in the discussion about global supply chains, in all the other video lectures, we understand that capital moves to countries where cheaper labor costs are underpinned by structural discrimination along lines of gender, race, caste, ethnicity, and so on. But in the case of global care chains, these workers now are moving to where capital is. So can you elaborate a bit more on this pull and push factor in the case of care workers, and how are the global care chains different from global value chains? Thank you.
Yes, I welcome you as well. And it's a pleasure for me to be with you. And thank you very much for this question, which gives me actually a chance to highlight the difference between global production chains, which is a key area of this course, and global care chains, my focus. You are absolutely right. In global production chains, capital is moved from the global north or from the capitalist centers to the global south or to the periphery of capitalism, and is invested thereover, maybe in industries and factories, or commissioning, subcontracting, and buying products. The main reasons are a cheap labor force in these countries and not many regulations for the production and the trading process, so that high profit margins are possible. Labor, mostly labor intensive, such as garment manufacturing or chip production, is outsourced from high-wage countries to low-wage countries. Thus, these transnational labor chains are based on global and regional inequalities and asymmetrical power relations. Now, global care chains are supply chains as well. And of course, I would call them value chains as well. However, it is labor which is supplied to the global north or to more well-off countries, actually cheap care labor, such as domestic labor or nursing or teaching. Not garments, shoes, or chips are the commodities supplied in these value chains, but care labor is a commodity on demand in these, let me call it, transnational care markets and labor, export and import business. This care labor is offered since many years by states like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Philippines, and more recently by Ghana or Mozambique to more wealthy countries because they face a severe shortage of care work. Sometimes this export and import of care labor goes back to colonial times. For example, in the Philippines, the US colonial power set up nurse training and then imported Filipina nurses from the 1960s onwards into the US. Nowadays, the main reasons for the states in the global south to reduce the surplus of labor and of unemployment in exporting countries and to earn remittances in foreign exchange. Second option is that countries in the global north officially and actively try to recruit care workers from the global south to manage their crisis situation. Their key motivation is to ensure a smooth social reproduction for their citizens at low costs, meaning without much public investment. For example, caretaking for children and the elderly, nursing in hospitals, because most of the states adopted austerity policies which cut down on public services. Or a third option, private recruitment and placement agencies and brokers mobilize a pool of care workers and organize their migration. The motivation of these brokers is, of course, profit-making. What these chains have in common with the production chains is firstly that they are based on inequalities between countries and households and classes. And secondly, that cheap commodities are supplied to the global north. However, in this case, it is cheap labor. The cheaper the labor force is, the more attractive it is in the transnational care markets. Construction of hierarchies, discrimination on the basis of gender, class, caste, race, and ethnicity, stereotyping and subordination, these are all means to construct a transnational care labor pool which is cheaply available, a kind of renewable energy source, and preferably loving, flexible, and docile. So we have a complex scenario of actors and drivers of this process of export and import of care labor, sending states and receiving states, agencies, public and private health and educational institutions in the global north, for example, hospitals which need nurses, and private households, families who search for a domestic worker or a caretaker in charge of providing for an elderly family member, maybe 24 hours and 7 days per week. Yes, care workers from the south move to countries and institutions where there is more capital and in particular more purchasing power than in their more or less poor home country of migrant workers. But the employer scenario is diverse. For example, the private households are often only lower middle class and desperately looking for cheap care workers because they cannot afford a well-paid person. What we have to keep in mind as well while analyzing these migration-based care chains and the structures in which they have developed is the care worker herself, I'm saying herself because the majority are women. As said before, the migrant workers are commodities in import-export business and in wage labor relations. And yes, very often they become victims of discrimination, vulnerabilization, and subordination, of miserable payment and ill treatment, but still, we have to perceive them as subjects who make decisions. Empirical research tells us that not the poorest of the poor migrate. Most of them are educated. Some studied at universities or are highly skilled. Migration is a more middle-class phenomenon. Many of them consider migration as a chance in their life to support their families at home, for social mobility, for achieving a higher consumer level, and some even for more personal autonomy. At this point, I would really love to discuss with you later on and hear your perception and assessment regarding migrant workers leaving your home country and region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christa, for that very insightful input, actually, on the Brian's question, but also for setting the scene for the conversation. Thanks a lot. So it's open for questions. We're not a huge group. Feel free to just make questions. So Brian, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Christa, for answering the question. And thank you for a great discussion on the course. Actually, I would like to follow up on that question because there's a limit in Zoom. So my follow-up on that is, what is the, I think you discussed it briefly, you know, because in global value chains, there are the one who is accountable, you know, the multinational companies. It's easy to spot for global value chains, but in the global care chains, no, when you said already that the employer scenarios are diverse, so how can you make the employers in the global north accountable if they are, you know, not as powerful as the multinationals? Thank you.
Yes, very good question, because this makes the situation so complex and not really easy for organizing and of holding actors or employers accountable. Of course, we in the global north or in the receiving countries, we have to address, first of all, the states and make very clear what is the role of the states in this import-export transfer of care labor. And the states in this are very active and responsible, but very often not very accountable actors. For example, I'll give you an example. The World Health Organization has a rule that, it's a rule, of course it's not a law, it's a rule that countries, wealthy countries from the global north shouldn't recruit health personnel from poor countries where there is a shortage of, for example, nurses or healthcare personnel. But in nearly all of the countries of the global south, there is a shortage. But the German Minister for Health during the pandemic 2020, he addressed the Philippines to get to recruit nurses for German hospitals because there was an appalling shortage of nurses. And everybody knows well that the situation at Philippine hospitals was much worse than in German hospitals. But he made a deal with, at that time, President Duterte, and Duterte offered, okay, so and so many nurses against so many vaccines. That was the time in the beginning of the pandemic where everybody was talking about vaccines, and not that vaccines were not at all available in the global south. So this is a very clear image for the exchange of commodities, the nurse against vaccines. And this is an example, for example, that states in this field, their prime interest is to have personnel, to make a smooth social reproduction process for their citizens possible, and without spending much money. So that's their interest to please and to satisfy and to pacify their constituency. These are the states. Then we have private institutions which recruit on a bilateral basis from countries from the global south. And since they are interested in profit making, they are interested to keep the labor force cheap. That is their prime interest. And they do everything with many mechanisms to do this. So we can hold the state accountable. And this is our duty, I feel, as a German citizen. I did everything, for example, with the help of publications, to show the German public what is happening. It is more difficult with companies and with private agencies, but the first demand is for the states, for European states, for example, to introduce European-wide, for example, minimal wage, labor rights, stay permits for migrant workers. So that they come to an equal level with domestic workers from the countries themselves. But you are right, it's not easy because we have this diverse landscape of actors.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Christa. Is there another question? But perhaps sorry, Aisha, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Christa. I was wondering if you could comment more on the triple win situation, how it's defined in the media, by the states. For instance, I've heard that they describe this migration as a triple win situation for the migrant, for the state, and for the sending country. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Yes, this is a program by the German government, and the program is operationalized by the GIZ, the Society for International Cooperation, and it's their task to recruit care staff from the global south, but it comes under the umbrella of development aid or development cooperation. And as you may know, there is a whole narrative around development cooperation, that it helps and supports the countries, the so-called developing countries. So it's a very generous act from the north towards the south to help them in terms of development. And what comes under development is as well skill development, education. So this triple win project is one way, this notion is one way on obscuring inequalities and power relations, because triple win gives the impression there are three parties which are winning, are benefiting from this program. This is the sending country, it is a receiving country, and the migrant worker. So three parties. And the notion gives the impression these benefits are at equal terms. And this gives us a good feeling, because if everybody of the three parties benefits, is a fine deal. But we know very well that this is taking place in very unequal relations, under very unequal conditions, which means in the end that the receiving country benefits a lot, and maybe the states in the south benefit a bit from the remittances, but the migrant workers, and this I really want to highlight, the migrant workers, even if they benefit by earning much more than they could benefit in their home country, even if they earn more, they pay a very high price for this, for this benefit. The high price in terms of leaving their country, leaving their family, very often get subjected to discrimination, humiliation in hierarchies, and very often de-skilling. So it's not an equal benefit. And what we want to do is really to analyze these different relationships and the hierarchies and power relations involved in this.
Thank you very much, Christa. Really very interesting. Any other question, Christa? If not, I want to pick up a bit on what you're saying, Christa. In particular, we know that a major pull factor is the fact that the developed countries for decades now are not investing on public health and public care, as you mentioned. So this is another quick fix for the system. So instead of expanding budget, we know that I remember several years ago when there was the discussion of the crisis of the health workers. They were saying how in the US, at least in the UK, the nurses were leaving massively their jobs. And we saw that particularly during the COVID-19, where overworked nurses were actually saying this is enough. So there is a crisis of the model of public health and public care that has really undermined these institutions, that is being filled by these workers that in the first place are trained with funding of states. So public funding has been spent in my own country, Albania, in the Philippines, and so on to train, and they just get these ready-made doctors and nurses in the country. So I think it would be interesting to know whether there is, on the one hand, in the developed countries, the plan to change the model of public care and public health more generally. What's the pressure there, and which are the groups that are pushing for that? Because one of the reasons why this pool forces exist is that actually there are empty slots. People in the north that don't want to do that job anymore, and then they get people in the south that can be paid less. So you don't change anything in that exploitative system in the first place. But also, what is it with compensating countries for furnishing the developed countries with nurses and doctors for so long? I remember back in early 2000, there were more doctors from Lesotho in a particular town in UK than doctors in the whole Lesotho. So it's just, the situation is scandalous. And if you can elaborate a bit on what are the actual debates on this now.
Yes, health systems in the global north have been changed in the past decades a lot due to austerity policies and to neoliberal management in the institutions. Both means that the states have withdrawn finances from the public sector. They cut down on public services and privatized a lot. But even in hospitals, in institutions where, which are still public, the market principles of being efficient, of productivity, of competition, one hospital competes with another hospital. Even in public institutions, these principles are now informing and ruling the management. So we have a neoliberal management in private hospitals, but in public hospitals as well. That means, for example, that cost cutting is the prime objective. And hospitals are all the time reflecting what can we do, that we specialize a lot. And we do, for example, a lot of orthopedic surgery and specialize on this and nothing else. And then we realize that, for example, hospitals in Germany are obviously doing many more surgeries in specific sectors than are needed. So they earn their money with this. And they do everything to cut down expense, and they need a lot of expensive technology for this. So at another end, they have to cut down expenses, and they cut down the expenses on the nursing personnel, for example. And this means that the personnel, it's completely overworked, which was all this became apparent and public and much discussed during the pandemic. They are complete overwork. They are working overtime and don't get their full payment for the overtime. So actually they do a lot underpaid work. And their work in the hospitals, but for example, as well the work with elderly persons in homes for the elderly is standardized a lot. And they get paid only the modules in the time which is scheduled for a certain module. For example, I know from my mother, who was in her final years in a home for the elderly, that they calculated very well. So many minutes they needed to compare. So many minutes they needed to dress her. And if more minutes are needed, this is unpaid work. So the whole work is standardized and tailorized like in an industry. And these forms of labor in the care sector are absolutely against the logic of caring that needs time. And this doesn't count in our system of increasing productivity. And till now, even after the pandemic, we have, for example, in Germany, we have perhaps a little bit better payment. But for the top nurses in the hospitals, they clearly say payment is no more their prime concern. Their prime concern is time, and that they want to provide good quality care. And they don't have the time to do this. And that is their main concern. And when you are asking, and I think Brian was asking before as well, how can this be changed, or where are the forces to change this? Of course, there has to come a lot of pressure on the hospitals from from the patients who actually pay for the system. But now in Germany, for example, and many other European countries as well, we have, in Germany, we have a hospital movement, in particular, starting from Berlin, a hospital movement where nurses, together with doctors and other staff in hospitals, went on strike and said, we want to provide good care, but under these conditions, this is not possible. And for this movement, they mobilize, they talk to patients in the hospital and explain to them, and they mobilize the patients to support them. And they mobilize, for example, in Berlin, they mobilize amongst normal citizens, because every citizen can be a patient tomorrow in the hospital. So that everybody understands health and health care work is a commons. And if this system won't change, then the workers and the workforce and their energies get depleted more and more. Now, burnout in this sector amongst nurses and amongst doctors is already recognized as a professional disease. And the same has started now very much with depressions, because in the pandemic, the situation was so awful that they couldn't bear it. And so many have to go for treatment now with psychological problems. And as you said before, many are saying, I will leave the job. I can't do this I can do it for a short time, but not for many years. So till now, we don't have signs for a readiness to change the systems. So we need the pressure from outside, for example, hospitals, and from inside as well. And there, that is some optimistic point about it, that we have this new movement coming up.
Thank you, Christa. Somebody wants to pose a question? Because I know that Christa has a question. Oh, okay. So we have Mira. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for the input. It was very interesting. I don't have a question, but a comment, maybe which leads to a question. I realized in different countries, like, for example, in Portugal, but also Brazil, Mexico, that a lot of migrant domestic workers are part of the family, for example, like, or not really part of the family, but they live in the family's place where they work. And it's very, I think it's very dangerous, because they are always available because they are there. But so it's easier to be always available, but it's actually, like, for the family, it's amazing, I guess. But for the migrant domestic workers, it's actually like they don't have a break. They have to be always available. And yeah, I don't know if this is maybe a cultural thing, like this working model or working time model, or is it something what comes up right now? Or I don't know. Have you any insights of this, for example? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are deep roots in feudal times, where the maid was living in the family and with the family, and was not allowed to have an own family or have own children. And it has deep roots in slavery, meaning colonial times, where it was clearly unfree labor. Now, in capitalism, we are always talking about free labor. So we have to unbundle this and check, are there elements of unfree labor in this? what you were talking about, that domestic worker, a maid, as was said earlier, is living in the family, with the family. And this is, of course, an obscuring narrative. She is part of the family. She is part of us. She is like a daughter or a sister or something. But at the same time, she is not. She is not living in the same conditions like their, let me call them, employers. And we have the same nowadays very much in Western Europe. In all over the world, still domestic workers are living in their families, in the families where they work and in the households where they work. But in Europe, and this is a coming back of an earlier situation, we have this 24/7 caretakers for the elderly who live in private households, very often alone with the elderly person. And then they are just-in-time workers, 24 hours. If the person calls them at night, they have to get up and care for the person or provide this, and that's what the person needs. That is their job. And in Germany, we know very well, if we say they work actually 24 hours, standby at least, they are paid normally for 6 hours of the day. So it's a tremendous underpayment in the contract already. And yes, in this sector as well, we have the first clear signs and start of a movement of resistance, because some caretakers of the elderly are going individually to court and brought this to court. In Switzerland was one case, in Germany was one case. And this is something absolutely new, that a Bulgarian caretaker in Berlin went to a court and reported how much she is paid. And since Bulgaria is part of the European Union, the court can rule about this contract. But then there is again a difference. Is the caretaker employed by an agency, which brought her, for example, to Germany, or is she employed by the household, by the family where she works? Most of the time, she is employed by an agency, and then this comes under European rule. And in both of the cases, in one case it was a Polish woman, in the other case it was a Bulgarian woman, she got her rights, saying that she has to get some payment, back payment from the employers. But the great fear is that next, these agencies will recruit women or people outside of the EU, so that they don't come under EU rule. But still, what is new in the recent past are these signs of resistance, of opposition, of strike, of, in the case of hospitals, of movements. And yeah, this is one indicator as well for the point I wanted to make. These workers are, agents. They have agency, and they become more and more aware of what is happening.
Thank you. I saw Aisha's and Brian's hands, but I don't know which one came first, so you choose.
Okay, I'll speak first. So I think I'll follow up on the comparison between care chains and value chains in terms of the push and pull forces that Edlera was talking about earlier, because in the one notorious mechanism in value chains is the race to the bottom, where countries are competing by the reduction of by imposing tax cuts, preferential treatments, exemptions from labor laws, etc. But on care chains, how are countries, how are their countries competing to get? Are they doing similar a similar mechanism like that? Are they? How can they still attract the care workers to move to their country despite competing with other countries to get the maximum profit? Thank you.
Oh, they offer nice things. For example, accommodation in a hostel, and at the first sight, for example, this 24/7 live-in work seems to be attractive because the worker has accommodation there. It said she can eat in the household, so she doesn't have expenses. So for many on the background, that in the end they earn quite an amount more than in their home countries, this is attractive. Yeah. But it's true. Countries are competing with each other. This became apparent in the pandemic situation, where all the Western countries eagerly were looking for nurses from the global South. Yes, and then it's a question: what can they offer? What can they offer? And nowadays, for example, the recently recruited nurses from the Philippines, they say that what makes the job here attractive is that they really have 3 days and they work 8 hours per day, and then it is it, and they can go home. So there are some rules which they don't have in their home country and which make it additionally to the income attractive.
Thank you. Aisha.
Okay, sorry, my microphone was acting up. What's the role of the private agencies? Because you mentioned them in the 2 cases from Bulgaria, the Bulgarian care worker, and also the case of the workers in Switzerland and Berlin. So I was wondering, what's the role of these private agencies in the commodification and subjectification of these migrant care workers? Thank you.
Very often the agencies move around in the countries and look for, in particular, young women who seem to be suitable for these kind of jobs. And then they give them some training. And in the training, they convey the message that they have to adjust very much to their employers, to the culture in the country, and so much. And there is some empirical research which shows clearly how young girls are prepared to be docile. They are constructed as very flexible and nice, workers in a different environment. And all what the agency knows about the receiving country and the employers there, and what they about their expectations is immediately imposed on the trainees, so that when they leave their country, they have the idea, if I adjust well and if I behave well and docile, then I will earn a lot of money and I will have a chance to be promoted and some social mobility, upward mobility, and whatever they expect from their job. Yes. So they play a role. And they, on the other hand, they make certain promises to the employers. For example, a main area for domestic workers are the Gulf states, and they want preferably Muslim, they want workers from Muslim countries, and the agencies promise them, I can bring you what you need on what you would like to have.
Thank you, Christa. Van Diko, did I say that correct? Or sorry, I'll call you Van.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Wanjiko. You just pronounce it as Wanjiko Maingi. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. So my question is about the domestic worker situation in the Middle East, where they use the kafala sponsor system. So is there a way, or can international bodies involved with human rights do more? Because like in our situation in Kenya, most of our domestic workers are suffering because when they go there and surrender their documents, you find that probably you are told you're going for a care job, just household work. And then you find that when you go there, the terms have changed. You are being forced to get into sex trade and other forms of slavery. You are also physically abused. Is there something else that can be done? Because they also confiscate the phones, the mobile phones, so therefore they cannot reach even to a neighbor or even to the embassy or, anyone who can try and help them. And then I know of a recent case where a woman, when she really managed to run away because she had to hide her phone. She actually hid it in her private parts, which is very sad. And so when she got the opportunity to go and throw garbage, she decided to run away at that moment. And when the employer chased her, she hid in a trench, and therefore the employer was not able to see her. The only number she had was the human rights office number there, and she was able to call, and they were able to reach her, and she got to their office where they found out that she had been burned. They were using a hot iron to burn her hands, and therefore she was not even able to work. And also she had been told she had to have sex with the relatives of that employer, which she refused. So anyway, the human rights office was able to reach the employer, and they took her to hospital. He was supposed to take her to hospital under tight security, but all the same, she's among the lucky ones, and she was able to come back home. But most of them are not able to come back home, and they end up dead. Is there something more that maybe human rights plus other international bodies can do about that modern slavery that is happening in the Middle East? Thank you.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. That is a form of modern slavery, of bonded labor. Are all of you aware what is the kafala system, or should I shortly briefly explain? You know or you don't know? Who knows?
Okay, the little I know is because, the trade union I work with also handles domestic workers. So we are in the process of trying to get even those migrant workers who are working under domestic work to join the union, to organize them so that they are able to tell us more of what is happening there.
Yeah.
Okay, so that we can be able to represent them right here at home, even even to air their issues to the government.
Yeah.
I know our government is trying a little bit to try and review that act and the laws concerning migrant workers, but it's taking a little bit of time. I think there is a tactical delay because there are some people who have investor interest.
Yeah.
So I'm asking, is there more that can be done? Because this is, I think it does not only affect our workers from Kenya, but I think it affects from other countries,
Yeah.
and they are being mistreated.
From many African and from many Asian countries. So let me briefly say that this kafala system is really a horrible form of institutionalized and state-sanctioned bonded labor or modern slavery, because the migrant worker gets legally linked to the employer. That can be a private household, that can be a hospital. You remember perhaps that the kafala system was very much in the international limelight when construction workers were building the stadiums for the soccer World Cup or for Olympic, I don't know what. They all under the kafala system. That means they come into the country and can come into the country only if they work for one employer who is called their sponsor. This sponsor pays for their trip, organizes the papers in the country, and then, first of all, the worker, be it a construction worker or be it a domestic worker, has to work without payment because the employer has advanced, so he says, so advanced so much money for her, for the trip and so on. Additionally, most of the time, the person has to hand in her papers, her ID, to the employer. So now she doesn't get along with the employer and she is horribly exploited or sexually abused and raped by the employer. What may happen? Or she even gets into prostitution, into sex work. Then if she decides to run away, as the case you reported about, she doesn't have her papers. This is a very crucial point. She can run away, of course, but if she succeeds in doing this, but she doesn't have her papers. That means from one minute to the other, she's illegal in the country. And she's only legally in the country if she stays at the very spot where the employer makes her work. And if she is illegal in the country, if she finds another job, this employment is illegal. And if the state or the police catches her, then she has to pay a huge fine and she has to pay for her own repatriation. So in the sending countries, trade unions and human rights organizations have to do a lot of pressure on the sending countries that if they make contracts with the Gulf states, that in the contracts it is said that certain rules and labor rights of free labor have to be observed. And in the receiving countries, in the Gulf states, there are now many human rights organizations or, for example, religious or church-related organizations who try to address the migrant workers there, and tell them in case of difficulties that they can get to them and get some support there. But in the pandemic time, these mechanisms didn't work because under lockdown, nothing worked anymore. So this is really the most horrible scenario one can land up, and organizing and making pressure on both sides is the only solution. What I want to add, because we are talking now about the kafala system and the Gulf states, that a similar mechanism is in the US as well. Many of the migrant workers from Latin America come to the US with a visa which is linked to one specific employer. And if they can't get along with this employer or something happens and they are no more with this employer, then are illegal in the country. And this is one of the main reasons for the many, many illegal migrant workers in the US. And illegal workers are always under tremendous pressure to find any job, to take any odd job, and can't organize or can't protest if they get absolutely dumping jobs and miserable wages.
Thanks, Christa. There is a last question from Savasara. In a situation of exploitation and discrimination at the destination countries, where can workers who can they approach for support, and what institutions and mechanisms are available, which is something you are telling us right now, right? The existence of the different organizations that are also emerging in the Gulf state, but perhaps also a more general point related to that as we are approaching the end of the seminar. So over to you, Christa.
An additional point is that we started by talking about value chains, and I'm very keen to stress that I consider transnational care chains as value chains as well, because they are value creating. And this is a very crucial point in economics as an academic discipline, that economics say, no, care work is not productive. So it's not really value creating. But we know very well, the pandemic has shown us that no society, no economy can survive without this work. This is producing and sustaining life. It's producing and sustaining the labor force. So it's very, very valuable. And for a long time, trade unions tried to organize productive work. And then they organized services as well. But, for example, not domestic workers. So they were out of the organizing and mobilizing range of trade unions. So there is a lot of work to do as well from the side of trade unions, that they are included and they get labor rights as well as so-called productive workers, because they are productive and value creating.
Well, thank you very much, Christa. This has been really, really interesting conversation. We are going to post it under your video lecture in the platform so other people can access it, and we'll also put it on YouTube. Thanks everyone for the great questions. We are meeting next week for 4 workshops for the last chapter of the course. So please stay tuned and join us in these conversations, and please watch the video lectures in advance so we can have as a meaningful discussion with our expert as today. So thanks a lot. Take care, everyone. And thanks, Christa. It's been really excellent. Thank you for your time.